Bill, being in here, being Memphis, the meetings, the conversations, all of these things, what does it bring you back to?
Well, it brings me back, Roland, to a point in my life where I learned the value of men who worked hard, yet the system denied them an opportunity just to be men. And I look at the photographs on the wall and think back as to what these men risked just to be treated with respect and dignity. And for me, it made the argument that I was one of the lucky ones. Really sort of standing on their shoulders, having an opportunity to not only help them be better men, but helping workers in general understand what it meant to struggle for just an opportunity to raise a family, to be a breadwinner, and to be treated with respect and dignity for the work that you did. And that's an incredibly humbling experience. But it also provided me with an opportunity to be able to talk this message and take this message and this movement to other people in other places.
Where were you, in 68? Were you based here? Were you working elsewhere? How did you come to play a role in the sanitation workers strike and what was happening in Memphis?
I was assigned here from Detroit, Michigan, the day of the strike. I arrived here the night of the 11th and was on the line with the men as they decided not to go to work the morning of the 12th. So from day one, I was here. The strike lasted 67 days. I had the highest parking bill for short-term parking in the history of the organization. I parked at the Detroit airport short-term because it looked like it was only be 2 or 3 days. I came back 67 days with a $500 short-term parking bill. So, this was for not just black workers, but the lowest paid of black workers, an incredible struggle that they decided to take. It was not something that the union decided for them. They had simply spent enough time working with a lack of respect that they felt themselves they were entitled to, and they decided what they were going to do. And in contrast to a lot of the glory statements, what they said was, we want two things. We want to build a union, and we want the workers to afford that union so it could do what we wanted it to do. And that was the story that underlined this whole struggle. And for myself and other staff people, we learned a valuable lesson from them. I cherish the time I had to work with these men and respect them as men, which was a part of their struggle.
What was it about them that was different than other folks you work with who were trying to fight for their labor rights? Was it something different about them?
There was something fundamentally different about them. There's that piece in the Bible that talks about the poor being with you always, but nobody ever said they're going to be the same group. These were men who recognized that they had a job to do. They was proud to do it. They had families to raise. They were committed to raising their families with all of the difficulties that they experienced. They simply wanted to be treated as men and respected for what they did. There's an incredible religious community. Men committed to showing up every morning, working very hard, irritated by the fact that they couldn't get a simple problem solved. We weren't talking about 50 cents more an hour or $5 more. We were just simply talking about the issues that generated disrespect in them as they worked. And they felt that the organization they were trying to form would really give them help in addressing some of these issues. I mean, they didn't think it guaranteed victory, but they thought that it gave them a voice in those decisions that affected their work life. And ultimately, I guess, their social life also.
Where did the I am a man come from?
Well, we were about 3 to 4 weeks into the strike. This was not an economic strike. This was a strike about respect and about being treated with dignity. And
because when I talked to someone, they said they couldn't take bathroom breaks. They couldn't take. It was several things they talked about. They had nothing. It wasn't about money.
No, they couldn't wash up. At the end of the day, they had to go home just like they had worked all day. There was no such thing as lunch breaks. I mean, you had to. It was just a bad situation. We reflected not only poor management, but poor acceptance of the responsibility of management. And these men were paying the price for those who supervised them, lacking either in commitment or sensitivity. And we tried to think through what is it that would reflect not only their commitment to this, but what is it that motivated them. There was a white pastor of the church, Claiborne Temple, a young fellow by the name of Malcolm Blackburn. After one of the real difficult days, he and I were tasked with trying to come up with some slogan that would symbolize this. So many of the pastors, so many of the community leaders had talked about the difficulties that these men work with once they themselves learned. And so we took some of their speeches, some of their slogans, some of their comments, and we just put a whole lot of words on the table to try and see what we could come up with that would be simple and short. So after maybe 2 hours worth of working with it, we came up with the slogan, I am a man. And it sort of reflected what we thought their commitment to this struggle was. They simply wanted to be treated as men. And, across the South, you could go from boy to uncle to grandpa without ever landing on the position of man. And so when we put that on a sign, we had a march scheduled for the next day. We came up with that sign the night. The sign was printed in the print shop of the AME church. So when men saw them the next morning, folks were running, I want a sign like that. I want that kind of sign to put around my neck when we march.
So why the underline of am?
Well, speaking personally, I am. And if you think for a moment, these are the lowest of the low paid. These are garbage men. I made friends with a fellow by the name of Ed Gillis. He had worked for the city for 20 years. He earned $7.80 a day. He wasn't complaining about it. I mean, he was much more committed to getting a resolution to a today problem. He'd worry about the rest of it later on. But it gave him a sense of pride. And for the work that they did, they simply want to be respected for it. And I had an interview with a reporter, and I said, when's the last time you told your garbage man thank you? When is the last time you told him you appreciate what he does? And folks said, well, I never thought about it. And that was almost symptomatic of the conditions that these men had. And that was across the city. It wasn't uniquely to the white community or the black community. They didn't get respect from anybody because nobody understood what they did. Most of us, we put the garbage out back and we figure it just disappears. And the fact that they wanted to be respected for what they did and to be treated as a man. And that became a piece of glue that you couldn't change to this day.
You said that these men, if y'all asked them to run through a wall, they would say, okay, let's go.
I mean, they were so committed to forming their union because they had developed among them the belief, not that the union was going to win everything for them, but at least they would have a voice. They didn't have Yale degrees or Harvard stuff. They were just plain workers. Most of them out of the South, most of them old before their time. I mean, this kind of work makes you old before your time. And they didn't have any misunderstanding about what was possible. They simply wanted an opportunity to be treated with decency and dignity. And when we developed the slogan, I hate to say it, we probably could have ended the strike the next day if because they felt just that proud of their commitment to this. We had to have a conversation with them because they had grown attached to this sign. We said, look, if we're going to proceed on this, what we want you to do is go home and talk to your wife. Tell her what you're doing, and then tell her what you think you're doing. And if she agrees with you, we'll see you tomorrow. Because this is not going to end like that. And so everybody who came back said they had that discussion. Now, I'm not convinced that everyone did, but at least they felt comfortable that they had their support mechanism at home in order. They were prepared to go the long term on this. And for us, what we brought to this was just a semblance of support to help them not only think through the issues, how to plan for what we thought was going to be some pretty tough days. And everywhere we see the signs, I am a man, for the two of us, it's certainly for me, it's almost humbling that men who were so desirous of believing in themselves was prepared to take those kinds of risks.
Does it bother you that every year when we approach April 4th, we forget what brought Dr. King to Memphis, and there's so much focus on him, rightfully so, but why he was here, and those individuals and their story and what they went through and what they experienced?
Well, it doesn't bother me. It makes me, I think, try to understand a bit more. Dr. King may have been a great civil rights fighter and certainly a great preacher, but he was also a very strong trade unionist. He believed in the ability of folks to sit down across the table from whoever made decisions on their work life and be a participant in that discussion. And if you recall, Dr. King was really trying to put a face on poverty. And here you had the perfect example of the working poor, people who worked every day, yet had no way of raising themselves beyond their situation or beyond their circumstance. And it was a movement that he had long said was necessary, that labor and religion and the civil rights movement was two of the three of the most dynamic forces in our society. And here you had men who as I said, they didn't graduate from Harvard, they graduated from the streets of hard times, but they recognized that their life could be improved if they had an opportunity to have an instrument to work for them and to speak for them. The mayor here says, well, you know, when the strike got underway, I believe in the men out, they can come and see me anytime. Well, you visualize a sanitation worker walking into the mayor's office to have a conversation about him, about his conditions of employment. It's silly. So they knew that unless they organized something that had the financial underpinning to speak for them, they were destined for a hard time. But they said, this is the time that we're going to do it. And I never regretted it. I can't help but wonder sometimes whether at least decisions that I helped them make or recommendations that I made to them could have been different. But Dr. King was committed to this work long before he came to Memphis. And the irony being that Memphis and the strike was in progress when Dr. King discovered what was taking place here. He was in Marks, Mississippi, I think, doing a rally on behalf of working poor there, and discovered Memphis. And his identification with it was important to the rest of the movement. But the two forces that he knew were strong came together in Memphis.
I'm gonna come back to him coming here, your conversations, your experiences, and certainly his assassination. But why, what was it? Why have you committed your life to the unions and to trade unionists and to the working man and woman?
Well, in simple terms, Roland, I come to the conclusion there are two kinds of folks in our society. There's the powerful and there's the powerless. And you can generally tell which group you're in. When you analyze it, you know, powerful people have things done for them. Powerless people have things done to them. And what's the difference? The difference is they're not the institutions, the mechanisms, the leverage in our community and among our workers to signal to the power brokers that these are people who need respect and looking out for. Across the South, the burden of the power structure keeping these institutions out of the hands of people who need them. And you can see it wherever you go. I mean, you can spot a low-wage neighborhood when you drive through it. And the reason it's low wage is because they have no way of gaining better wages, better benefits, social power, political power. And those are the things I think a trade union brings to workers in any setting that they work in. If you look at our nation as a whole or the world as a whole, those people who have access to political power, to social leverage, to better conditions, have trade unions. Roosevelt in 33, 34, whenever, he recognized the imbalance of power also and created the National Labor Relations Act, and people got the right to organize. But even in his wisdom, he left a lot of people out. And the fact that he left a lot of people out, we're paying for some of that today. Workers who have high skills, who have access to training and preparation, life may be difficult for them, but it's not impossible. For workers like sanitation workers, who have no opportunity to organize, no opportunity to be represented, no opportunities or the skills to appear before a commission or a board and tell their story, they have nothing. And my commitment to trade unionism is because it doesn't do things for them, but it creates space where they can help themselves do things. And I think for me, the satisfaction comes from helping workers like this use their latent power to change their conditions, or to help workers across South Africa recognize that you can alter history by coming together and applying the basic principles that even powerful people use. That is, you can use your strength to alter your conditions.
Prior to him coming to Memphis, had you known Dr. King, talked to him, met with him?
I had met with him once, had talked with him once, and we were discussing the same thing we're discussing now. How do we change the condition of the working poor? You've got millions of people who work in hospitals. They get sick, they can't even get into bed that they make up. We had talked once about a program in Chicago where hundreds of thousands of hospital workers, primarily black and brown, worked in the hospitals, yet they had no way to alter their situation. And when I say alter their situation, if you're earning average $1.35 an hour, I mean, you're not going to have a great life. You may survive. So what our discussion was is how do you merge, the civil rights movement and the trade union movement, and interject the religious community and talk about their moral responsibility to help these people, move towards a better life. And in Chicago, Dr. King ultimately created an organization called HELP, Hospital Employees Labor Project. And it helped them change their circumstance. And we weren't reinventing the wheel. We were doing what workers years and years ago did, whether it's mine workers or machinists or what have you did, to alter that situation. Now, we were also not misled that the trade union movement is no utopia. It has its shortcomings like everything else, but if it gave us an opportunity to get engaged, to get involved, to move up through the ranks of organized labor to the positions of power, that you could think through how to and where to bring organizational strength to organized workers. That was it, simple. And I became wedded to that idea.
So I talked to Reverend Jim Lawson, and he said that the group decided we need to reach out to Dr. King and bring him in. He said he was tasked with making that call.
Right.
What was the reaction of these regular, ordinary men once y'all told them he's coming?
You couldn't believe it. I mean, there was such a not only love for, respect for, but appreciation of the fact that Dr. King would identify with their struggle. And whether or not he talked about their specific situation, but just his moral authority and moral leadership would deliver a message to those who they believed held the power over their lives. And that went beyond just Memphis. Dr. King brought press no matter where he went, brought media, and the belief that if you can get the story of their strikers outside of Memphis, then perhaps other people would become sensitive to what they did. These were men who came up from the Delta, or from West Memphis, or from Arkansas, who had worked a lifetime without any respect whatsoever. Like I said, this was not an economic strike. They simply wanted to find a way to resolve problems they had every day. We had a situation, Roland, where if the weather went bad, black workers in these areas were sent home. Everybody else stayed at work. If the sun came out and it stopped raining, they got paid. These guys lost a day's pay. You lose a day's pay and you make $7.80. That's a major setback. And so the question is just fairness. The question of the city being sensitive to the work that they did. And it wasn't just for them as black workers, this was them for all workers. And if Dr. King could help them get that message out, if he could talk to a broader audience, they saw that as a plus.
What was it like? First of all, you clearly heard about him, heard about how he could sit in a room and listen to that side and listen to that side and listen to that side and then listen to that side, and then sum everybody's arguments up and then say, we're going here. What was it like to witness him in those meetings discussing tactics and what we should do next?
Well, the thing that Dr. King had was this incredible respect from everyone. There may be disagreements, but it was a respect of his beliefs in the right thing to do. And so even among those of us here who were trying to think on a day-to-day basis strategies, there were disagreements. But in the end, you'd say, well, Doc, what do you think? And whether it's coming from the SCLC staff or coming from the local leadership through the organization Community on the March for Equality, or coming from the union, these are three different entities with three different levels of interest.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a respect for his views that guided everybody into a course of action. I mean, there was some of us there were some folks who didn't believe in the march, or marches, but they all acquiesced to Dr. King's view that we not only got to march, it's got to be nonviolent, but it's got to be focused on the power center and power structure that had the ability to change this. We had a mayor who had just got elected with no obligation to the African American community for anything, totally insensitive to the needs of the community, and absolutely outraged at the fact that a black workforce would raise the question with him of changing the process to accommodate to them and give them representation. That was different. That was different.
You had the march that he led. It ends in violence. I've read numerous books that said that he was shocked, he was despondent, he was depressed. That literally, when they took him to the hotel, they put him under the covers in his clothes because he just could not believe what happened. And I talked to Janona Clayton and others, and they talked about just this tremendous strain and stress that was on him and his body in that last year. Did you see it? Did you feel it?
Yeah, I was in the meeting when he came from the march to the Rivermont Hotel, as I recall, and he was physically, shocked by what he had. But we didn't understand at that time what were the forces beyond our control. And there are the folks who would argue, well, there was a young people who disliked his style. That may be partially true, but what we had were provocateurs whose mission it was to not only diminish his image in the eyes of the nation, but to disrupt this march in a way where the strike itself would be damaged, the demonstration of his lack of control and influence, and challenging the level of influence that the local community had in terms of moving towards a solution.
And that's what happened, because all the press the next day, national media, oh my God, he's lost it. He can't control. He's no longer relevant or important.
Right. And you had members of Congress speaking in Congress at his absence of influence any longer in demonstration to affect public policy. And he was troubled by that. It was just a short while after that, maybe 6-8 months after the strike ended, Senator Frank Church held a set of initially unrelated hearings when we learned about some of the influences that were put to play in the strike right here in Memphis. And it's interesting reading. And the men were more determined than ever to continue their struggle. I believe that was on about the 28th of March. And what went unnoticed, young fellow, 16-year-old, killed by the Memphis police, unrelated to the strike, but included with the strike issues. These were really very difficult times. And the men began to understand that their struggle was a part of a much larger struggle.
I've heard the 43-minute and 16-second speech he gave April 3rd, Mason Temple. If I'm correct, he shouted you out in that speech. You were there.
Yes.
From your perspective, describe that night, that experience.
It is, that was probably one of the worst nights. Weather-wise, emotions were high. Dr. King was tired, a little bit beaten up. And he really did not want to speak that night. Ralph Abernathy was the so-called principal speaker. And Ralph gave a tremendous presentation, but people wanted to hear Dr. King. And they charged somebody with going and getting Dr. King. I think he was trying to rest, but he got up and came over. And he gave what has come to be known as the mountaintop speech. And you know, you could tell, at least you could assess that he was tired. But he saw the crowd that night. He saw the recognized need for him to say something to these people. He must have had 18, 20,000 people. The church was at Mason Temple. And he summoned up all of his preaching skills and his analytical skills to talk about the conditions that were in front of us. And, you know, I mean, it was just an unbelievable night. And I personally, we will not forget it. It was one of the high points of listening to social and political rhetoric. It was just a tremendous presentation. And people went out of the church ready to march, you know, on April 5th. You know, I mean, and I think they probably would have marched through brick walls and anything else, but it was a motivating speech preparing them for the march that was going to take place.
Were you surprised at how focused he was on economics in that speech? Because he talked about boycotts. He talked about redistributing the pain. He talked about how SCLC put money in a black bank. He talked about, I mean, again, what frustrates me is most people have heard the last 3 minutes of that speech. But to hear the totality of this 43-minute speech, where he has a laser-like focus on economics as the future pathway for African Americans.
No question about what he had concluded, that there's a power system that perpetuates itself and keeps people in these conditions. And he talked about, as you said, all of the ways in which you force that system to become engaged in relieving the problems and pressures on the working poor. And as you say, he's talked about the boycotts and the movement of money and the deposits of money and all of the ways in which you can put pressure on the system to force it to become engaged in relieving the problems. It was one of the, I think, more dramatic speeches I've ever heard. It also had a sense of, well, at least Dr. King gave the impression that he was weary. He talked about his almost, death in New York from this lady who stabbed him. He talked about a lot of those kinds of things. And then as he began to wrap the speech up, and I think he was talking to the people who had urged him to come over, and he was maybe reluctant at first when he talked about the man who was injured along Jericho Road, and the fact that other people stopped by and asked the question, should I stop? Should I keep going? And he said for him, the question was, what will happen to them if I do not stop? And it it pulled all of these things together and reminded us, some of us, of why this struggle was taking place. Because this was not a normal kind of strike that trade unions or community movements identified with. And we certainly thought clearly that we're here until the end. I mean, you cannot walk away from this. You can't sidestep it. And he made all of that clear in his speech. And I for one, think that Dr. King had finally sort of, I shouldn't say finally, but had identified some of the root problems and root causes of problems that perpetuated the poor, where you had a situation where incredible wealth and incredible poverty lived side by side, with no embarrassment from and he saw the working poor as the future work because it involved the economic struggle that he had begun to think seriously about.
April 4th. What were you doing that day? What was the day like?
Oh yeah, every day was a day of mobilization. We would meet with the men to the degree if there was any progress. We'd report on what that was, or if there were any unusual things happening, fill them in on that. If there are any questions they had or decisions they need to make, to try and get that done. But everybody was mobilizing for the march.
But you also had a court hearing that day, if I'm correct.
Yeah, that was a series of injunctions, but SCLC took responsibility for dealing with the injunctions. Andrew Young and James Orange and some of the other fellows and their lawyers took responsibility for the court because the court had enjoined the march. It had not enjoined the mobilization and community action work that we were doing.
So that day goes along. You go throughout the day, you get to the evening. Where are you?
I'm at the headquarters building of what was called then the minimum salary building of the AME Church, which is a building next door to where our mobilizing headquarters were, which was Cleveland Temple. In the evening, I lose track of the time, but the word came over the radio that Dr. King had been shot on the balcony at the Lorraine Motel. And among all the unbelievable things that you just refused to accept, this was one of them.
So you hear this on the radio.
So a co-staffer and myself, we were like 5 minutes from the Lorraine Motel. We jump in the car and we come around here. And by the time we get here, police were already here, keeping people out as opposed to keeping people in. And this whole evening was just one that we had difficulty believing. Dr. King, as prominent a leader as he was, to be shot on the balcony made no sense to us at all. It was not like he was a stranger in town. He should have, and perhaps did have, as much security as you could have. But the evening ended with not only with the shooting, but with him being taken to the hospital. Our responsibility then was to make sure that nobody else was injured. I mean, the city obviously was just outraged, and our job was to make sure that the people, got home all right, didn't confront the police or anybody else with any activities that would cause there to be more harm. And then to reconvene a meeting of all the partners in this thing to talk about where do we go from here.
You get word that he's died. Where are you and how do you react?
Well, personally, it was an incredible level of sadness. It was not like you had a leader who preached violence. You had probably one of the most committed men to nonviolence, yet to be killed through a violent act. We were a little, we had to think through what this all meant. How and what do we do with the men the next day? How do we handle the notification across the country as to what was taking place in Memphis, and at least whatever advice we were going to give to other folks, how they should react? And clearly, the country was beginning to go up in smoke. The anger that was across their major urban areas was just incredible.
I interviewed Reverend Jim Lawson, and he said the next day he went to work. He said, we literally did not have time to stop. And he said it wasn't until either July or August that the grief hit him. He said, but literally, he was completely in work mode.
Well, I think that's typical of everybody, and certainly Jim, who was such a major part of this. We had 1,300 men, 1,300 families. Who knows how many children that were a part of all this. We had a community by now that was totally mobilized in support of them. There needed to be direction given. There needed to be a conversation with the leaders. There needed to be addressing the young people, many of whom had become reluctant supporters of the strike, but they were supporters. We had to at least make sure that no one gave reason for added violence against any community members. And to try as best as we could to prepare for what ultimately became a major march on behalf of Dr. King himself. And we were getting deluged with calls from all over the country of people who really want to know, is it real, is it true, is it, et cetera. I distinctly remember a call from Byatt Rustin, who was on a radio show in Westchester County someplace, where people were equally upset. And I think Byatt mentioned on the radio, if you want to do something to help people in Memphis, send $1. And the outpouring of concern and support, in a day or so, we felt down here where there was duffel bags, army duffel bags filled with dollar bills that people were so impacted by this. But as Jim said, we didn't have time to stop. We almost went from his death mode to mobilizing for this major march that we got committed to. I believe we had 40 or 45,000 people show up for that march. We had to deal with what was going to take place in Atlanta. And to their credit, the men, while they regretted and was suddenly upset by Dr. King's assassination, they remained committed to their goal. And they organized themselves. They made their own decisions about how they would respond on a city basis. I can remember we were a little concerned about whether or not we wanted to take the marches back downtown. A minister here in town whose name may be lost in all the history, Reverend Henry Starks, who took just personal responsibility for organizing and mobilizing the march to dramatize to the business community and certainly to the city leadership that these men were committed to this. And I think we wanted to take a day off, but the men asked us, aren't we going back downtown? Aren't we going to march today? And for those of us who were staff, we had to really not only pick ourselves up, but to try and understand that, this was a tragedy that happened in the course of a major movement, and understand that Dr. King was certainly aware of the risk, but he was also committed to the movement.
Just a couple more questions. We were out there today, the wreath laying ceremony, and you heard these men say that here they are 50 years later, still fighting for rights and respect. So many people, I think, go, well, March was successful, they got what they wanted, but the fact that they still have not been made whole.
Right. right, right.
That has to be angering to you,
It is. It is.
especially in a city that for the longest was black run, black mayor, black city council.
You're absolutely right, Roland. The fact that there is not a pro-worker environment, there's not a belief that workers have a right to participate in those decisions that affect their work life, which would give them the right to sit across the table and negotiate safety procedures, promotional opportunities, grievance procedures, retirement, vacation, sick leave. While these workers have much of that, they don't have the clear-cut right to do that. And even if they achieve it, one stroke of a pen can take it away or threaten its existence. We've got a responsibility, we in this context, I mean the union, trade union leadership, to develop leaders and procedures that carry on across the years. Generations. What these men did, and I really appreciate the action that President Obama took. He put them as a group into the Labor Hall of Fame because while many of them would never realize the benefits from the struggle, it laid the foundation for those who come after them to benefit. The proudest, well, I shouldn't assess for them, but I've been told by one of them the proudest moment they had was to have been told by President Obama that what they did was a part of the foundation for his being the president of the United States. And whether it's Memphis or Toledo or wherever, where men are denied the right to struggle for a better life, what you've got is a boiling pot ready to boil over. I mean, anyone should be entitled to the opportunity to speak for themselves or have someone speak for them. Yeah. I look across the room and I see a picture of the mayor of the time, as a city at that time, a fellow by the name of Henry Loeb, who just had no idea what the city was moving towards. And I would say the strike and the conditions to resolve the strike were met twice before the assassination, based on what the men were asking for and what the city, through the city attorney, was prepared to accept were met a half hour after we met in the mayor's office. The mayor assigned his city attorney and his deputy city attorney to get with us and just sit down and put something on paper. We put it on paper, it met our needs, met their needs, and gave it to the mayor, and he went berserk. I won't sit with these people and discuss their situation. I am the mayor of Memphis, Tennessee. I'm prepared to take the shirt off my back and give to them. They never understood that what they'd like to do is buy their own shirt. So we settled a strike twice. And the tragic loss, in spite of the fact that conditions were met, is what troubles you more than anything. And young people who are now a part of the process should know the history of what these men did to change the situation here in Memphis, not just in the workforce, but to educate them around their responsibility to continue, not just to struggle on behalf of themselves, but for their community. And Memphis ought to be a better place.
Last question. Next to last question. We're in a period where labor participation is at its lowest. For African Americans, there's tremendous benefit to being in unions. Yet, for the last 30 or 40 years, Republicans or conservatives have been very successful at basically turning the word union into a vulgar name.
Mm.
How do you feel when even you hear younger folks when they hear union? Ooh, I want to hear that. Horrible idea. Unions are terrible. Unions are bad. They're obscene. Last thing I want is somebody controlling my money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the areas where organized labor has not done a good job is to talking about the role of organized labor in a democratic society. Many workers come into the workplace and the conditions that exist right now, benefits and et cetera, folks assume the employer gave them that out of their kindness they decided that they needed 3 weeks vacation or what have you, without knowing how you got to that point. So we have an obligation to talk to people, not describing the employer on a constant basis as an adversary, but talking about them and our role in a contested environment where the union is fighting for the needs of not just those people who are members, but for society as a whole. And that the union's role in that is to be doing the ongoing work and thinking through the needs of workers and families, to thinking about the programs and policies that make for a better, more fair, and more equitable society. And if the argument is all about whether or not you're going to get a nickel more an hour, we're never going to win that argument. Now, in the context of what we should do with regards to building power with employers, historically, we've been in a situation where we organize in one member at a time. And the opposition has been able to define us as counterproductive, as opposition, as obstinate. And we have not defined ourselves as well as we should. Mm-hmm. It was really not the employer who gave us retirement pay. It was not the employer who gave us sick leave. And we have to develop our own narrative for making people understand how this came about. I think in terms of organizing, we've got to approach organizational work differently, I think, than we have in the past. We have to organize to build power, not organize for one more member. We talked earlier about, Lech Walesa and the Polish workers. Mm-hmm. They were organizing around issues of political freedom and social justice. That's where I think our struggles are. I mean, the new workforce of the future are young people, they're immigrants, they're women, they're African Americans. These are the people who want to be organized to share in the benefits. We're not interested in bankrupting the corporations or those who bring the jobs. We simply want a voice in how to make those jobs better.
30, 40, 50 years from now, a kid's going to walk through here. They're going to see these photos. They might be in Detroit or in D.C. They might be reading a book. They might be watching a documentary. And they're going to see the name or they're going to see the face, Bill Lucey. What do you want them to know about you?
Well, I think if anything, the lucky break that a Bill Lucey got was to be able to develop some understanding, some skills, a little bit of commitment that was valuable in helping others sort of find a way to join a struggle for a better life. To say to people, if you work together collectively, we can find ways and means of developing and focusing on the program that makes people's life just a little bit better. I think you're going to always have the inequities in wealth and income. The question is, can we bring enough folks together who have the kind of influence socially and politically to develop the programs that just make life a little bit better. There's an old saying by an old trade union is, what is it that labor wants? You know, a little bit of leisure, a little bit of recreation, some health care, a little bit of education, something to make us better people in the society we got to live in. And if they come to that conclusion, I'll consider my contribution to have been meaningful.
You want to check out Roland Martin Unfiltered? YouTube.com/Roland S. Martin. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. It's Roland Martin Unfiltered. See that name right there? Roland Martin Unfiltered. Like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's YouTube.com/Roland S. Martin. And don't forget to turn on your notifications so when we go live, you'll know it. Hey fam, want to check out Roland Martin Unfiltered, the blackest show on all of digital, cable, and broadcast. Check out our audio podcast. There's only one daily digital show out here that keeps it black and keep it real. It's Roland Martin Unfiltered. Press play.